An RAF Wellington bomber on a routine nighttime training flight takes off into a moonlit sky. It's been in the air just 6 minutes when, from darkness, a second Wellington suddenly appears. Moments later, there's a terrific explosion, and the two Wellingtons plunge to the ground, killing everyone on both planes. It is, on the face of it, another tragic wartime accident.
The reality is that 13 people lost their lives. They're the forgotten heroes, aren't they?
The two inexperienced crews are inevitably blamed for the crash. But is that the full story? Were the authorities too quick to denounce dead men? And did the real blame lay a little closer to home?
The only people that really know what happened are the guys that are now dead.
Was there a simple failure of procedure?
Even though each aircraft had lights, it wouldn't be obvious to each of the pilots the other aircraft was there.
Can World War II air crash detective Garth Barnard piece together the clues to discover what really caused the Turweston Wellington crash?
The pilots just would not have seen that plane coming towards them.
It's quite possible, yes.
There was two pilots in the sky that night with no night flying hours. It was an accident waiting to happen.
You're the pilot. It's your life on the line.
For the past 20 years, Garth Barnard has been investigating World War II RAF air training crashes. He studied thousands of incidents, but for him, the collision in the skies above Turweston stands out.
Something strange about this crash. I've always been intrigued since 10 years ago meeting the postmistress at a local village, when she told me of a plane coming down in flames and the possibility of it colliding with another aircraft, but there just wasn't the evidence out there. I just couldn't find anything, so I would really like to find out more about this.
Wellington bomber HE-325 is preparing to land after completing a nighttime navigational exercise. The plane is being piloted by 32-year-old Flight Lieutenant James Shaw.
He was dark and good-looking and fairly sort of cheery, and he was very engaging, and we loved him. We thought he was great.
Meanwhile, on the airfield below, another Wellington bomber, BK-272, sits on the dark Turweston runway, awaiting clearance for takeoff. Its pilot finally gets the all clear, and the Wellington's 290 Bristol Hercules engines power it down the runway. The pilot points the aircraft's nose in the direction of the full moon that hangs in the sky ahead of him. The bomber quickly builds up speed, and it lifts off into the night sky. Minutes later comes the collision of the two aircraft, a huge fireball. No chance that anyone on board will escape.
So was this crash just a tragic accident, or was there a lot more to it? I mean, and why is there so little data? All my years of research, I've gone through so many different crashes, and the data's quite readily available, but in this instance, it's very, very difficult to find out what actually happened. Was it human error? Was it a mechanical problem? Was it a procedural failure? This is the sort of thing I really need to find out. One thing I have learned is the more you look into these crashes, the less clear cut the conclusions. At the end of the day, young airmen lost their lives that night. We owe it to them and their families to find out the truth.
To begin his investigation, Garth needs to examine the official records. What can they tell him about the doomed planes? He's come to the RAF Museum at Hendon in London to see if their vast collection of accident report cards can provide him with any vital information. Accident report cards, called ARCs, were a system of cards developed by the RAF that recorded details about wartime air accidents in a simple indexed format. Can Garth find the right cards among the thousands in the Hendon archives?
This is one of them. This is the date's right, Wellington, BK-272, just to see if there's a second aircraft. Yep, here's the second aircraft, yeah. So we've got both ARCs for both aircraft. What I'll do now is I'm going to print these both off and look at the details.
So what details did the ARCs provide?
I'm looking at the ARCs here from both machines. This one has details on BK272 and this one on HE325. Looking here, we can see the pilot was instructional pilot Searles and a pupil pilot of what it looks like Harakze. It lists those two names, but it also states here that there was 7 on board and 7 killed, 7 fatalities. Looking at this aircraft, HE325, we can see that it was piloted by Shaw, and there were 6 on board with 6 fatalities. If we look at the details of what actually happened here, it says that the aircraft took off into a bright moon and struck another aircraft, which was actually higher, with both aircrafts crashed in flames. And again, on this ARC, it says struck by another aircraft in flight at 1,000 feet, both crashed and burnt.
13 men lost. The scale of the accident is shocking. The cards showed that the authorities blamed both crews equally and that they failed to keep a good lookout. But Garth has noticed the cards also conclude that navigational lights would not show up well in full moon. So which is it? Was it solely the crew's fault, or did they never stand a chance because of the flying conditions? For Garth, the cards lack important detail.
It has details here of the engines, the aircraft type, the pilots and their hours on type in both day and night. It says there's 7 on board on one, 6 on another, but there's actually no details of the crews themselves. It doesn't really give us a lot of information on what they were doing. What we do know is that both aircrafts hit each other, but that's pretty much it.
The official explanation for the crash seems too simple. How is it possible for the two planes to fly into each other? Surely the controllers on the ground should have known that the close proximity of Shaw's plane posed a danger to Searles before he took off. If anything, the official records seem to have posed more questions and not given answers. On the accident report card, the names of the pilots have one letter written in a column coldly beside them. K for killed.
He was always Uncle Jas to us, this rather dashing figure in uniform. A very glamorous figure at that stage, obviously, because anyone in uniform was a bit of a hero. His wife was called Helen, and he had a baby son at the time of his death. And he was always the sort of hero figure, if you like, who died during the war.
So why were Shaw and Searles flying Wellington bombers over Turweston airfield? Garth has come to the old RAF airfield of Chipping Warden to speak to local RAF airfields expert Roger Saunders about the role Turweston played during World War II.
Turweston was entirely a training base, part of 92 Group, and that was its total and only role. It trained on Wellingtons, it trained on various other types of aircraft as well. A lot of these people were really very, very green. They'd been to elementary flying, which flew a single-seat aircraft, and then they were expected to pick up a Wellington. And flying Wellingtons was very difficult.
Unfortunately, Turweston had to get used to seeing air training accidents.
There was quite a lot of crashes, not all fatal, some were, but the crashes didn't just occur locally, of course, because a lot of these aircraft, Wellingtons especially, went on fairly long flights. Then the losses then continued due to navigational errors. Killed lots of pilots doing that. It was very busy looking at the airfields because they were very close together. And if you think that they've all got to take off, they've all got to land, they've all got to do their flight, and they've got to miss each other on the way back. Now, it sounds easy, but it's not.
Just how close the airfields were together is staggering. Within a 15-mile radius of Brackley alone, there were no fewer than 13. Perhaps it was not surprising that accidents occurred regularly. There were more than 400 during the war in this small area of Britain. Some were lucky, of course, and managed to walk away from the wreckage relatively unscathed, but many more did not. The figures are sobering, to say the least. During World War II, almost 7,500 men were killed in training incidents in Britain. Most were men who died before seeing any frontline action. The inexperienced Turweston training crews faced a whole set of challenges and dangers. There were always the added dangers posed by mechanical failure. Could that have played a part in the accident? The fire that consumed the planes made it impossible to be sure. But how reliable an aircraft was the Wellington bomber considered to be? By July 1944, the Vickers Wellington had been replaced by the famous Lancaster heavy bomber as the leading aircraft in Bomber Command's operations. But it was still a formidable machine.
The Vickers Wellington was a twin-engined medium bomber, and it was really the backbone of RAF Bomber Command's fleet until the advent of the really heavy four-engine bombers, so the Stirling, the Halifax and the Lancaster, a little bit later in the war. When the RAF staged its first 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne in May 1942, more than half the participating aircraft were Wellingtons.
With its revolutionary aluminium-weaved geodesic frame, developed by Barnes Wallis of Dambusters fame, the Wellington was affectionately known as Wimpy. It was strong, it was solid, and it was able to take an extraordinary amount of punishment. It seems that mechanically the pilots of BK-272 and HE-325 should not have had a problem.
The beauty of the geodetic method was it meant the Wellington could absorb huge amounts of punishment, huge amounts of battle damage, and still make it home. So from that point of view, it was a very reliable aircraft, although it did have the slightly disconcerting characteristic of weaving about a little bit, bending and creaking a bit in flight because of that very structure.
The Wellington was a rugged aircraft, certainly, but those used by the operational training units were end-of-line planes that had seen a great deal of action in the field. Could that have affected their reliability?
You'll hear reports of getting bogged down. You'll get times where you've got prop swing. You'll probably find that you lose propellers, literally. There was one flying over Silverstone to Turweston, and it got off the ground and then lost the propeller. It just disappeared. Collapsing wheels. Wellingtons were a bit prone to dropping an undercarriage.
So who else was flying on board the doomed planes that night? Garth has found out a little more about the 10 remaining victims.
I've managed to track down names of the other members of crew. Initially, I used the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website. I typed in the date, which I had, and I got pages and pages and pages of names, which isn't surprising given the bloody war that was over the skies of Europe at that time. But to get the names, what I did was use this fantastic book.
Bomber Command Losses by W.H. Chorley is a series of books that chronicle every aircraft loss in Bomber Command during the war.
Okay, if we flick through the pages, here we go. On the 7th, 8th of July 1944, Wellington HE-325, which we know was in the air that night. We know that from the ARC. But listed here, what we have are the names of the crew that were on board.
The book reveals that flying with Flight Lieutenant James Shaw that night were the 36-year-old Sergeant William Mitchell and Sergeant William Willett, aged 31. Also on board were Sergeants Henry Kinchin and Leonard Barker, who were 28, and 19-year-old Charles Wyatt. Garth also finds out more about those flying BK-272, with the two pilots, Searles and Terraze, was 20-year-old flying officer Arthur Cork, Sergeant Peter Woods, who was 21, the 27-year-old Sergeant Bernard Hadlow, and Sergeants Robert Bradford and Jack Lemon, who were both just 19.
Haraze, he was Canadian. That explained the unusual surname, and so was Cork. He was Canadian too. Well, reading through this, we've got a lot more detail on what happened.
The book confirms most of what Garth knows: the time of takeoff for each plane, the length of their respective flights, and the location of the crash. But
we know Searles was instructing Harazay that night, but who was actually at the controls at the time of the collision? Also, looking at the amount of crew on board, we've got 7 here, so I'm expecting to see maybe there was 2 or 3 gunners or 2 or 3 navigators, wireless operators, which would time with the fact it's a training flight.
what the ARC reveals is that Searles had flown 1,314 hours in total, with 520 hours flown in the Wellington, including 128 at night. Pilot Officer Harazay, on the other hand, was far less qualified.
Harazay had never flown Wellingtons at night before. Look, 150 hours flying time, but in this column under type, it's got nothing. So you've got to deduce that Searles was the instructor, Harazay was the pupil, but who was actually at the controls at the time of the collision?
Garth notices something else on HE325's accident report card.
Shaw has a lot of flying hours, we know that, but only 13 on type and none at night. Was he an experienced trainee, or was he just an experienced pilot transferred over to Wellington to build his hours up on that new machine? With Harazay at the controls, that means there was 2 pilots in the sky that night with no night flying hours. It was an accident waiting to happen.
With the ARCs noting that the bright moon impaired visibility and that the navigational lights would not have been easy to see, Garth decides to visit one of only 2 surviving Wellingtons to see for himself what it was like inside the cockpit.
This is my first time in a cockpit of a Wellington, what strikes me is the amount of vision that the pilot has. I mean, the instructor pilot would have been here, the pilot's here, but you've got to remember it's pitch black. There would have been a full moon. Suggestions there were he was dazzled by the moon, but he'd be using instruments primarily, and you'd have no real horizon being so dark. Of course, there was a blackout, so there's no lights on the ground to go by, so it must have been pretty difficult to be on the lookout for other aircraft that were in circuit at that time. And not forgetting that further down the fuselage would have been windows down the side, so there could have been lookout from there, but this aircraft would have been climbing, and the other aircraft would have been coming around in front of it. So the only person who really had a lookout was the pilot and the instructor pilot. The records state, or the Court of Inquiry states, that the crew should have been or had a proper lookout. But it's difficult to have done that with your cockpit drills, with taking off, and the other aircraft would have been circling anyway. And also, they're not very, very well lit. So I really can't see how the crews could have been blamed as such.
And what of the visibility outside of the plane? How illuminated was the bomber? Brooklands volunteer John Lattimore describes the lighting limitations on a Wellington.
Basically, I think you can say there's not very much of it. It consisted of the normal port and starboard red and green wingtip lights, a light on the front of the nose of the Wellington, which I think you can see an example over there, which is a formating light, which was shrouded, so it can only really be seen from the front. And you had, again, formating lights towards the top of the rudder. As I understand it, 1 blue, 1 white. And underneath the nose of the aeroplane, which is for signalling purposes, so it can be used for signalling to the ground. Hence, it's underneath the aeroplane. And that's it, as far as external lights are concerned.
The lighting you talk of wasn't like the big bright lights you see on modern aircraft now?
No, not at all. You're talking about car tail light bulbs, basically. So you know what that is. It's not very bright, no. And certainly not from a distance in the air. But they weren't designed to tell anybody on the ground where the aeroplane was, for obvious reasons.
Interestingly, John is not convinced by the ARC's findings that the crew were to blame.
To be honest with you, it seems to me that you had the unfortunate set of circumstances where the only people that really know what happened are the guys that are now dead. So if your airplane that's now in circuit flying on its own, probably would not have his full mating lights on. So he's only got his wingtip nav lights. He's sideways on to the aeroplane that's taking off. So we've only, if he's on an anti-clockwise circuit, he's only got his port nav light, which will be visible to the aircraft taking off, which is, you know, a little red light in the sky, and it's a bit difficult for some pilot who's taking off to know that. This was a convenient let out. You've got a crash or a collision that occurred, killed a number of people. Somebody's got to come up with an answer, so you come up with an answer that says, well, they weren't really doing their job very well, were they? You know, which is unfortunate, but I think it's convenient.
Why would the authorities want to find a quick and convenient excuse for the collision? By this time in the war, RAF Bomber Command, under the leadership of its commander, Arthur Bomber Harris, was becoming a formidable weapon for the British. With their American allies pummeling German targets during the day, British crews kept up the momentum by conducting massed bombing raids at night. But this effort came at a cost. In 16 operations launched against Berlin in early 1944, over 1,000 aircraft and 7,000 airmen were lost. And all these men and machines needed to be hastily replaced for Harris by the RAF and their OTUs. Accidents like the collision at Turweston were regrettable, but the authorities couldn't let these incidents get in the way of replenishing crews and keeping the pressure up against the enemy.
By the beginning of July 1944, the bombing campaign was still pretty much in full swing, even though we were then well into Europe. There was still a need for crews. I mean, we know now that the war was beginning to come to an end, but they kind of didn't know that then. They still had the Japanese threat. They thought there were going to be many more years of war against Japan. So really, the training system was pretty much in full swing, although, as it happened, by July 44, that was actually when the size of the Royal Air Force reached its peak.
Garth tries to pinpoint the exact location of the crash. He has the grid reference from the ARCs, but unfortunately they don't correspond with modern maps. Happily, there's a solution.
OK, we're 2 miles away now from the airfield itself, and looking at the ARC of Searles aircraft here, it states the Ordnance Survey coordinates for where the crash site was. That doesn't correlate or relate to any modern-day Ordnance Survey maps, so what I have to use is a 1943 Ordnance Survey map, and from that, I can work out the exact position of the crash site. And remember, this is the crash site of Searles aircraft. This is about 2 miles away from the end of the runway, so it just goes to show how close from the end of the runway the incident was. And this aircraft travelled a long way after the collision itself. It's positioned over here in the middle of the field. You can see it from here, good view, and probably where about those 2 trees are on the hedge line itself. Probably about in line with those, but in the centre of the field, which is exactly where it's positioned on the Ordnance Survey map. Now I know the exact crash position of BK-272, which was Searles aircraft. I can try and find out how it got here and which actual runway was in use at the time. I really would like to get to the bottom of this and find out the truth of what happened that night.
Having established where one of the planes crashed, Garth travels to Turweston airfield to try and finally piece together how the accident happened. He's come armed with some startling new evidence.
As we hit a wall with the British sources, I decided to contact a Canadian colleague who gave me information on the Canadians on board BK-272, and the information he's given me is absolutely fascinating.
Garth's colleague has found the official Court of Inquiry report in the file of one of the trainees, Walter Harazay.
The Court of Inquiry gives a detailed account of what happened to Harazay's Wellington BK-272, and I quote, "This aircraft, after taking off, is assumed to have climbed towards the second aircraft, which was at a higher altitude. The climb was made almost directly towards the moon, and the pilot looking in that direction may not have seen the other aircraft due to dazzle. Navigation lights displayed by aircraft under the prevailing atmospheric conditions of light and haze are almost ineffective. With the lower portion of the tail light blacked out on the Wellington aircraft, there is a sector below the aircraft in which no light is visible. This was a possible cause of the pilot being unaware that another aircraft was dangerously near.
The report also gives a graphic account of what happened to Shaw's plane, HE-325. It records that after circling the airfield at 1,000 feet, Shaw was given permission to land at 1:17 a.m. The planes collided just outside the circle of airfield lighting on the perimeter of the base. Garth explains what happened next.
As the main planes of the aircraft H-325 were not broken, it is assumed that the aircraft was banked at the time of impact, the front turret hitting BK-272 in the mid-under position, and the starboard propeller cutting into the port tailplane. The starboard engine of HE-325 dropped out after impact. The aircraft caught fire and did a flat spin to the ground. The tail unit of BK-272 appears to have broken off, and the rest of the aircraft crashed straight ahead, dropping pieces along the way. That sounds like a horrendous impact and something neither crew is ever going to be able to get out of. This report now raises questions about the plane's times.
This fascinating document raises a few new questions. Garth originally learned that the collision occurred at 1:28 a.m, with BK-272 reportedly taking off at 1:22 a.m. This new report gives BK-272 a takeoff time of 1:14, with no actual time for the collision.
There seem to be a lot of discrepancies regarding the times of BK-272. Even allowing for a possible mistake in this record, a 6-minute flight time seems to be way excessive if you consider it collided with Shaw's plane that was just a little way off the runway and ended up 2 miles away. What was it doing for 6 minutes? In the report, it describes Searle's plane as doing dual circuits and landings. I think I need to find out more about what these terms mean and what were those two planes doing that night.
Steve French is a pilot who flies regularly from Turweston. He's agreed to take Garth up on a flight and to explain what a circuit is.
What was the point of a circuit? Why were they derived and what do they do?
Because it's the safest form of approaching and landing at an airdrome and leaving an airdrome. There's a specific circuit, which is basically a box in the sky. You take off, you climb out, you turn right, you turn right, you turn right, and you land. So it's like a box in the sky.
And what determines whether we turn right for right-handed or left for left?
Because that's being determined by the airdrome. So they've made this a left-hand or a right-hand circuit. So it's down to the controller to specify which way the circuit is going to be. So.
How many aircraft could be in a circuit?
It could be up to six or seven, in which case it gets really busy. And some aircraft are slower than other aircraft, and this is a particularly fast aircraft, so unless you can slow it down, you might encroach too much on the plane in front, and thereby you would turn out and circle away from the field and then come back.
So if I've got a box and I'm turning right in a right-hand circuit, what do they call that to the left then? How do they
That's the dead side. It's the dead side of the runway. So if we were coming to join the circuit, we would join on the dead side because there's no aircraft flying that side. So we would descend, and we'd aim to descend over the end of the runway at about 1,500 feet, 1,600 feet, and then we would be dropping down to 1,000 feet. By the time we got to downwind, we would be then in the circuit downwind and joining. But the dead side is the side of the runway that there's no aircraft, and obviously that's the side you want to join if you were joining this circuit.
So how do they miss each other? Is it purely height when you're joining circuits?
Yeah, it's purely height. So if you're joining dead side, you wouldn't be at 1,000 feet over the end of the runway. You would ideally be at 15, 16 or 1,700 feet as you cross the end of the runway. So any planes taking off are still only going to be at 400 or 500 feet. And then by the time you've joined the circuit, you're at 1,000 and you've sort of meshed in with everybody else. But ultimately, the pilot has the last word. If you don't think it's safe, then you make the decision, because you're the pilot. So it's your life on the line.
As Garth circles the airfield, he can see how close the crash site is to Turweston. One detail missing from the records is which runway Searle's plane used. Could finding that information yield more clues? Garth meets with local astronomer Mark George. Can he shed more light on the question of the runway?
Mark, what I do know is that the crash site was in this direction. But what I can't confirm and what I don't know is the actual runway in use that night. What I do know is from looking at the official data that the moon had an important part to play in that. Is there any way you can tell me where the moon was on that night?
Yes, absolutely. We've got a fantastic piece of software here that allows us to turn back time. So by using this, we can see exactly where the moon was on that night. So if you have a look on here, we turn the time back to 1944, and it shows us that the moon, if we have a look in this direction, we're about 28 degrees in the sky. So we're looking at about this patch of sky just here.
So then, if we position the map then, right now we're stood at the intersection of these two runways, so it could have been any one of those. We know Westbury's in this direction. From what you've said with the moon being in this direction, it does confirm that this was the runway in use at the time.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, for any pilot taking off from this particular runway, they're going to have the full glow of that moon in their eyes as they take off.
Would the moon have been very bright that night? Would it have had an influence?
It would have. It would have been very bright. On that particular night, it was a waning gibbous, and it would have been giving out about 90% of its moonlight.
It's quite plausible, then, that the pilots just would not have seen that plane coming towards them.
It's quite possible, yes. The moon would be that bright. It'd be akin to having a torch shone in your eyes, really. And for any pilot heading into that, it's going to be quite dazzling for them and confusing.
From the information he's gathered so far, Garth has come up with a timeline of events. At 1:14 a.m., Charles Searles is given permission to take off with his crew of 7. As it's Haraze's first nighttime flight, Wellington BK-272 remains stationary as he, Searles, continues teaching him. After returning to the airfield and circling, Flight Lieutenant Shaw in Wellington HE-325 is given permission to land. At some time between 1:17 a.m. and 1:28 a.m., Searles Wellington takes off to the southeast into the face of the full moon. Now Shaw's plane is beginning to turn and drop to 1,000 feet at the head of the runway, so that he can come around and fly to the far side, where he'll start his final approach to land. Shaw's Wellington smashes into the tail of BK-272 and slices it off. Shaw's craft flat spins to the ground and impacts on the perimeter of the airfield, while Searles Wellington manages to remain in the air before it too crashes near the village of Westbury. But Garth believes that it was the controllers on the ground who may have been at fault.
The flight time of 6 minutes must have been a delay on Searles' part. He must have been sat on the end of that runway for the whole of those 6 minutes. And what I don't understand is why those flight controllers did not abort his takeoff when they knew Shaw was still circling and still in a dangerous close proximity.
Perhaps the staff at Turweston knew that they were partly to blame for the accident. But this was wartime. Keeping morale high was all important, and it might have been that the authorities wanted nothing to discourage or dispirit trainees. Pilot error was perhaps a neat, tidy, convenient, non-controversial explanation for the crash. Garth is still wrestling with the one hole in his theory, however.
I think I can explain the 6 minutes. It's probably Searles going through his cockpit drills while teaching. But what I don't understand is how Searles managed to get his aircraft up to 1,000 feet and collide with Shaw's off the end of the runway. Either that or the official records that state 1,000 feet are incorrect and the collision between Searles and Shaw's aircraft was much, much lower.
Luckily, pilot Steve French may have unlocked the entire mystery. His theory accounts for the lost 6 minutes and both planes' altitude. To explain his theory, Steve takes Garth up in his plane to retrace the last flight of Searles Wellington, BK-272.
He would have been standing still at the end of the runway, at the end of the tarmac we can see now. He would have been there, engines full power, and he would have started his run. We can time it if you want. Okay, I would start it about now. He would have been powering down there. It's obviously been cut short. I imagine it went a bit further than that in World War II. We're about 2 minutes in now. 2 minutes in, making the turn. He approached Brackley. He's on his crosswind leg. Now he's flying downwind. That's 3 minutes. That's 3 minutes. We're turning now. Nearly 4 minutes now. We're on base leg now. So now we're turning finals. And we're now on final approach. The aircraft would either land from here, or it would touch and go, or it would power up and go around, depending on the exercise that the instructor's putting the students through. The runway was extended like it used to be. We're probably touching down around about now. What time have we got? Go up on that.
We're just got to 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Well, okay, we're a smaller plane, so maybe we wouldn't be a little bit more agile than a large bomber. So, you know, 6.5 minutes is not going to be far off.
Back on the ground, Steve reveals more.
Obviously, we've just flown this circuit, and it was a right-hand circuit to runway 15. I believe that the pilot and on the Wellington that was taken off, he had a student with him, and he was on his very first circuit. There's a 6.5 minute delay in between the time they talked to them and the accident, which would basically be correct for taking off, flying a circuit, and rather than landing, doing a missed approach. A missed approach is where you're on approach, you decide to throw the landing away, and you take off and go back round. As he got a student with him, it was the middle of the night, I would imagine that, you know, the first one would just be for a look. So he'd come round, have a look, he'd be at 500-600 feet, he would say, right, go around, the pilot would then pull up, he would soon be at 1,000 feet. Meanwhile, the other aircraft's coming in to join the circuit from the dead side. This is the dead side of the runway because obviously it's a right-hand circuit. This aircraft coming in, he probably knew where he was. He could see Westbury over here. It was dark, it was moonlit night. He may have picked up a couple of features. As he was coming in, he would be rolling slightly left to make sure he was over the end of the runway to the right. And the way the way the two aircraft have impacted, it would make sense that obviously that they would hit each other there. This aircraft then went down there, and the obviously other aircraft spiralled in basically at the end of the runway. The only way this aircraft could have been at this point at 1,000 feet is if it's already in the air. It couldn't possibly have taken off and got to that height in such a short distance. If he had landed and then took off again, he would have probably only been 500 feet here. You know, and the other pilot at 1,000 would have been over the top of him, you know, enjoying the circuit, and he would have been safe and he would have been fine.
Steve's theory has finally solved 10 years of frustrating research into the Wellington collision. Garth has sent all the evidence he has discovered on the Wellington collision to air safety expert Gary Wan to see if he agrees with his findings. Gary begins by assessing the efficiency of air traffic control at the time.
Air traffic control during wartime is certainly different to the way it's run now. And essentially, the person in air traffic control will be recording takeoff times and landing times. There wouldn't have been a map to plot where the aircraft are. There's obviously no radar to see where the other aircraft are. And clearances given to the aircraft are almost procedural in that the aircraft is given permission to carry out a manoeuvre, and it's up to the pilot then to carry out safely. By giving procedural instructions, you're allowing the aircrew to carry on and carry out manoeuvre, but what that lacks is the control over the aircraft and making sure that you haven't got two aircraft in the same place at the same time.
So why did the crews not see the other's aircraft that night?
If the two aircraft are on a converging course, a collision course, then there'll be no apparent movement of one aircraft to the other. And it's a well-known fact that the human eye picks up movement. So even though each aircraft had lights, it wouldn't be obvious to each of the pilots the other aircraft was there until very shortly before the collision.
With the numbers of planes in the skies increasing all the time, and our major airports becoming busier than ever, how does modern aviation minimize the possibility of a collision between converging airliners near an airport? Former RAF and commercial test pilot Chris Roberts explains the systems that have been developed to keep the modern traveller safe, even in limited visibility.
You have on board your aeroplane a thing called a TCAS, which is a collision avoidance system. And you can see on your aircraft displays where the other aeroplanes are that are coming in towards the landing point, which is also the beginning of your takeoff point. So you have that basic visibility if you're in bad weather, and of course you can see them if the weather's good. And of course, air traffic knows where they are, so air traffic will be telling you. But at a particular point when you requested your departure, you will be cleared onto the runway, and you will be cleared takeoff. And the two calls may come together, they may not. Air traffic now never use the term takeoff unless you're cleared to take off. So once you're cleared to take off, you have to go very quickly, because everybody is working on the assumption that you will move very quickly after you've been given clearance, and that will allow you to slot in to your place in the pattern of aeroplanes that are coming into land and have already taken off.
Now he has finally discovered the truth. Garth can tell the relatives of the Wellington crash what he's found, and a 70-year-old mystery can at last be resolved. Emma Bonner Morgan is the great-niece of Flight Lieutenant James Shaw. The family had believed that James was killed while training in Scotland. Garth meets Emma to tell her more.
It was 1:15 in the morning, so it's pitch black. Very, very dark. But also, there was a full moon, so that some of the land was lit up. So you've got an aircraft which, by all accounts and reading through this research, was taking off into the moon, so he had the bright moon in front of him, and then you had another aircraft that was circling around. So the aircraft couldn't really see each other. So when it comes to fault, the Court of Inquiry states that perhaps both crews didn't keep proper lookout, but to me that's a bit harsh because the two aircraft, very, very dark night, just collided with each other. How much information had your family received regarding this crash, and what did you actually know?
My grandma told me about him and had said there'd been an accident, but she didn't go into details, and I suppose she didn't even know that much. But actually seeing it all here again brings it back to life. But, I mean, she was very sad, and obviously I didn't want to ask too many questions because I could see how much it affected her. I think it's, you know, fantastic to have this information and fills in some of the gaps that we didn't know. It's quite emotional, really. Here's his photo. Brings him to life. Actually seeing the written word really brings him to life as well. The reality is that 13 people lost their lives, which is desperate. They're the forgotten heroes, aren't they?
For Garth, this is a very satisfying end to his 10 years of research.
I'm afraid, after looking at the evidence, this is just a tragic accident where neither crew can be portioned absolute blame. There's a lot of factors involved here. Firstly, it was a very inky, dark night, but for Searles and his trainees, he had the brilliant, bright moon, which had a dazzling effect on him. Also, the Wellington's got to be portioned blame here, to a degree, simply because the lights are very, very small and they would have been painted out. They're very, very dim, very, very difficult to pick out. And on a night like that, where it was incredibly dark, it would have been virtually impossible to see the other aircraft.
That terrible crash in July 1944 was just one of many hundreds that cost the lives of so many young airmen during World War II.
The thousands of deaths that happen in training are a footnote in history. But by researching crashes such as the collision of the two Wellingtons at Turweston, hopefully people are made aware and understand the bravery and sacrifice these men made behind the front line. It is something we should not forget.
God bless the finest, bravest souls, no more to fly or walk. Their precious blood was spilled, no more to flourish, love or talk. May they always be remembered, and may they rest in perfect peace. God bless their souls and families, and pray that evil wars may someday cease.
Love this program? Buy the DVD at ABC Shops, Dymocks and the SBS Shop online.